Welcome to Tuesday Talks. I'm Seema Kumar. I'm the CEO of Cure. And today our guest is Gillian Sandler. She's a longtime life sciences investor here in New York City and a passionate advocate for battling autoimmune conditions that afflict tens of millions of people, including members of her own family. She invests in companies and projects, and her investments include Linus Bio, a precision exposome sequencing company from Mount Sinai Hospital, and Envisagenics, a drug discovery company focused on transcriptomics spun out of Cold Spring Harbor Labs. Gillian also has a keen eye as she follows the biotech investment trends and markets. She has had great success in picking companies and tracking the latest developments in science and technology, including AI and health. And she's here today to tell us about some exciting news and some exciting new results in her company called Mimi, which uses novel techniques to treat symptoms of autoimmune conditions. And she's also here to give us some tips on what's happening in this volatile moment for investing in life sciences and health tech. Welcome, Gillian.
Thank you so much for having me here.
Yeah, great to have you here at Cure. And thank you for joining us for this Tuesday talk. So let's get right down to it, right? Tell us about autoimmune conditions. What are they and how do they impact people?
Autoimmune conditions in the simplest terms are when someone has a disease or a condition that results in their immune system recognizing their cells as a foreign invader or creating inflammation and attacking your own cells. And there are many different autoimmune diseases, and the difference between them is really what type of cell is the target of the attack. So how that manifests for people.
Yeah, so it manifests like for women as lupus and
lupus and psoriatic arthritis and multiple sclerosis and rheumatoid arthritis. So there's many diseases.
And that's when, the immune system, which is actually designed to protect us, views the body itself as, something to be attacked. And that's what happens in these diseases, right? So how big of a problem is it? How many people does it impact? And what are the challenges in treating this disease?
Well, the last census in the United States by the NIH was back in 2012, and that was on data from the previous decade. And at that time, they measured the market as 23 million people. And they also measured the number of people that have autoantibodies, which are a biomarker for that is prior to the development of an autoimmune disease or during an autoimmune disease, and that was 40 million. So you've got 18 million people on top of the 23 at that time that had the signs of autoimmunity or the potential for development.
Yeah, so that's a lot of people who have conditions like this. So what do they do when, either when they realize that they actually have autoantibodies, which means like it's a precursor to you potentially developing an autoimmune disease, or if you actually have the disease, what recourse do you have? What's current standard of therapy?
Well, all of the current standard of care and the therapeutic approach is based on inhibiting your immune system from attacking you. So there are broad.
Well, that doesn't help, right? Because you don't want your immune system to be
well, it does for some people. They are able to lead. There's downsides to the drugs because you are dialing down your immune system, and it's all targets that have functions in your immune system. So there's a balancing act if you have an autoimmune disease, because the therapeutic benefits also have risks. So it's a balancing act between the two. Some people have very good reactions to those drugs, and it helps them, have fewer reactions and responses to their environment, which is what really autoimmune diseases are flare-driven diseases. So the symptoms come and go, episodes come and go, and so if these drugs can help dial that down and dial people's responses to their environment, it can be very productive. the challenge for that is that for many people, they have an inadequate response to those drugs. And so they're left really with managing a disease based on trying to control their symptoms. And it's very hard because they also have to make difficult decisions about immunosuppressants because of the risk of infection and cancer and other diseases.
Yeah, and so that's, as you said, a balancing act, and a very delicate balancing act,
Yes.
right? And I mean, you know this close, upfront, and in personal because your own family members have had this, right? Tell us a little bit about how that personal stories impacted your interest in this.
Well, my twin sister
Oh,
is
twin sister.
fraternal,
Yeah.
and so we were a good example of the difference. You're in a family, and we ate the same foods. We grew up in the same place. We went to the same schools, and she would have strong reactions to her environment from a young age, and autoimmune conditions that were entry conditions to later in life. And so she was diagnosed. She had asthma and eczema, and then was later, after 3 children, diagnosed with RA. And then she was one of the people that unfortunately doesn't have full response to these drugs. And so she went through a very long period of trial and error related to these drugs. That was the challenge for her. She morphed into lupus and has now mixed presentation of autoimmune disease, which is very typical of people that that evolve in their disease over time.
Yeah, and I'm guessing that, status quo, what we have today in terms of, management of the condition, therapy, or even prevention maybe, is not enough, right? And so I'm guessing that you, your sister, and many other people who are experiencing these conditions are not satisfied with the status quo, and you want to see something better, right?
Yes.
And that's where the interest comes from. Well, you have a company, MyMe, which actually completed some clinical validation studies, right, using its technology to treat some terrible symptoms, actually, of autoimmune diseases. Can you tell us a little bit about the company, what it's doing, why are you interested, what are they doing that's different, and what the results of the study are?
Well, to clarify, the company was founded by a Danish woman transplant to New York. Her name's Mette Dyberg, and she started the company with her own story. She was a non-responder to Humira and went through the same story of trial and error between drugs, diets, to try and identify what created her flares. And so she developed, this was her first patent was filed 10 years ago. And I had first traveled all over and spent a lot of time looking for clinical trials for my sister and looking for next generation therapeutics for her. And I found that the studies were very narrow and were not suited for people. In cancer, when you mutate and your cancer evolves, you're more likely to make it into a clinical trial because the clinical trials are focused on people that have failed all standard of care. In autoimmune, it was very different. So the people that have mutations to their disease and evolve find it very hard to get into clinical trials. So that was one piece in terms of the strategy from a therapeutic perspective, that she wasn't well suited to the pipeline, which also said to me, well, if none of the clinical trials in the pipeline are there, then we're 10 years away. From 20 years away from where a drug could get to. And so one of the things that I had found was there were a lot of people who had solved their own case. So there were people who, not a lot, but you would find there were people that had spent years trying to figure out what drives their disease until they ultimately became researchers and were able to get their own disease and symptoms under control. And so I looked for people who could, may have started a company or figured out an opportunity set to help others do that. And I found this woman, Mette, who had developed a protocol and a solution to help people do that. And the the way she did it was merging technology and some disciplines related how you think about clinical trials, where you need to isolate variables and create a controlled environment in order to be able to understand what that research is. And so the protocol that she had created was to help people isolate their own symptoms and then directly correlate what within their entire environment is triggering the different symptoms. And so that was something, I mean, it took her years to develop that and then many years to first test it with individuals, and then she came to us as investors when she was trying to identify what would be the right research in order to be able to develop an economic model for the market to be able to cover it. So that's what it was, and the unique side of it is the challenge is that anyone who has their disease under control with their drugs does not need this. And anyone who doesn't really does, because each person, the big challenge for everyone is celiac, we know what the trigger is, it's gluten. And all of these other more complex diseases are really dependent on the individual. And so how do you create an environment and leverage technology in order to be able to do that? And that's what she developed. So the company spent the last many years on research and has had they completed one study that was critically important that was a partnership with an insurer to finally be able to match the data of the whole healthcare record and the cost structure with the efficacy of the program to really identify what is the meaning for this in terms of the utilization of healthcare and what does this mean for drug reduction or adherence. And so that was critically important because there's no model to be able to cover programs like MIME. So it takes a lot of economic data also to start to understand how this fits into the healthcare system.
So where do things stand now with all this research that's going on?
Well, they just completed a multi-year study that that the final data was in October, and the importance of that was there was 18 months of data tracked after that person, and after the program, and one of the big challenges for autoimmune diseases is that they're relapsing and remitting diseases. So it's very concerning for physicians to the idea that you know, how do you understand whether someone should stay on a drug or not stay on a drug? And we have 719 new startup companies in the market right now that are adherence tech. So they're tackling the significant problem of how do we get people to stay on their drugs? People that need it in order not to wind up in the hospital for a heart attack or need it to make sure that they can beat cancer. And then in autoimmune diseases, it's much more complicated because these are all surrogate biomarkers for the drugs, and there's a lot of subjectivity to whether a drug is working or not working. So, and the current standard of care is to add drugs if the drug isn't working, and that's true even in the trials investigating the drugs. So if you're 12 weeks into a trial for a new drug and it's not working effectively, then the doctors can add more drugs to that. So there's a lot of confusion about what is working, what is not working. And in the real world, that's amplified. And it's particularly concerning and scary for patients who are non-responders and their doctors, because if you go off a drug, could you get even worse? So one of the big things about this study that I think is exciting is it finally gives a chance for doctors and patients and stakeholders in the industry to start to understand it's possible for patients to identify what is working and what is not and safely go off of drugs if they're not, and if they stay on them, to get much better outcomes out of that. And so this is one of the big things that comes out of this study that's really important and critical and now possible, which is to see that when people went off the drugs, when they had positive response, that you have 15 months on average of data that showed that not only can you get off of these drugs, but the total healthcare costs, not just the drug cost, but the total healthcare costs are much lower, and that people can empower themselves to really be in a situation to improve their own health, and that the data is there now for the dialogue to start to happen in the market about what is an adequate response.
Yeah,
we cannot only have adherence tech, we also have to have the support system so that when people need to go off a drug, they can do that safely.
Yeah. That's great. That's great.
The other thing that I would say is that there's a lot of confusion about whether there's a polypharmacy problem. Is that a problem or not? And how do we identify who's responding and not responding? And one of the things we've done is really work with insurers and identify, when you look at people who are on a drug that's $50,000 or $100,000 a year, how do you identify ways to understand response and non-response? Well, once you look into the data from a population health perspective, you see that over 50% of people are on 4 or more drugs.
Yeah.
And in that group, the number is on average over 6 drugs. So you start to really see that people are suffering. They're not really getting the response. And I think part of it is, we first have to really identify problem, measure the problem, talk about the problem in order to start to help doctors and patients understand, and also greatly expand the therapeutic approaches that we have in the market to start to get to much bigger budgets to fund new drugs and change the approach to how we're doing the trials to assess the drugs.
Yeah. No, that is really important, and important to understand, because, at what point do you also stop and say, okay, shall I add one more? Shall I add one more drug to the regimen, right? But I think, thank you, so much for the great work you're doing. One last question before we let you go. So what do you think the future looks like for, just life sciences companies who are getting started, is there enough room? Is there enough innovation threshold left still for people to be interested in investing in it?
I think that there has to be some catch up between the life sciences tools and technology and research capabilities and the reduction in cost structure to get there. We've had a renaissance of innovation tools that are supposed to take massive cost out of the system and massive time out of the system, to go from 30 years, target discovery to market and patient hands. And so we did so much work in the last 10 years as a system to get to a place where real world evidence could game change the clinical and real world mass market side of how we understand drug development and drug research and efficacy. And then we did so much to try and be able to create new models, organs on a chip, all sorts of different tools in order to be able to really dramatically change what's possible. Manufacturing, the struggles of saying, okay, we had CAR T years ago, but it's still not a mass market. And so, and you see it in the prize, the prize that you guys have been sponsoring, where you see really talented people now saying, not just about the problem of innovation, of what's a new target but how do we innovate in a way that's going to dramatically reduce the cost and increase the possibility set to make precision affordable. Because that's our biggest challenge right now, is that once you get out of the standard of care, you've got tens of millions of people. Each person is an orphan disease. And so how do you, and once you get to precision, you wind up having $2 million drug. So how do we start to think about these things to actually deliver on much lower cost, higher outcomes, and faster time to market? I think that's what's going to, and precision, all of that. And I think that is what we need to start to, get excited again about capital in the market.
That's great. That's wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Gillian. Thanks for joining us. Thank you for visiting Cure and joining us on Tuesday Talks.
Thank you so much.